The crimson sun blazed across the Pacific horizon as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, his weathered hands gripping the rail with the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. It was June 3rd, 1942, and the combined fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy stretched across the waters like a steel constellation, the most formidable naval force the world had ever seen. 6 months had passed since Pearl Harbor, and the rising sun flag had conquered every ocean it touched. From the smoking ruins of Manila to the fallen fortress of Singapore, Japanese naval aviation had rewritten the rules of warfare. The ancient samurai spirit, forged in steel and flame, had proven superior to Western technology and tactics. Nagumo's 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had earned their place in legend, their pilots considered invincible warriors of the sky. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Seize Midway Atoll, that tiny speck of coral and sand 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii, and draw the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor and supreme commander of the combined fleet, had conceived this operation as the killing blow that would force the United States to negotiate peace. The American Navy, still reeling from its losses, would have no choice but to defend Midway, and when they came, Nagumo's carriers would annihilate them. Below deck, maintenance crews swarmed over rows of Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers and Aichi, Valdive bombers, their engines gleaming under harsh electric lights. The pilots, young men barely out of their teens, bore the sacred responsibility of the Emperor's divine mission. They had trained since childhood for this moment, their spirits tempered by Bushido, and their skills honed to razor sharpness through endless hours of practice. Each wore the traditional rising sun headband, a symbol of their willingness to die. For the Emperor and the homeland, the intelligence reports were encouraging. American reconnaissance flights had spotted Japanese submarines near the Aleutian Islands, confirming that the diversionary attack on Dutch Harbor was proceeding as planned. The Americans would split their forces, sending precious ships north, while Nagumo's main force struck Midway like a thunderbolt from the east. Radio intercepts suggested the enemy had no idea of the true scope of the approaching assault. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto of the carrier Soryu reviewed the battle plans one final time in his cramped quarters. The initial airstrike would pulverize Midway's defenses, clearing the way for Admiral Nobutake Kondo's invasion fleet. Once the atoll fell, the American fleet would have no choice but to engage, and they would face the full might of Japan's naval aviation. The Americans had never experienced anything like the coordinated fury about to be unleashed upon them. As dawn approached on June 4th, the sea remained deceptively calm, its surface broken only by the wake of the advancing fleet. In a few hours, Nagumo's carriers would launch their aircraft and strike the first blow in what Japanese strategists confidently predicted would be the final naval battle of the Pacific War. The tradition of Japanese naval supremacy, unbroken for centuries, seemed destined to continue. None aboard the Akagi could have imagined that they were sailing toward not triumph, but toward the moment when 3.5 centuries of unquestioned naval dominance would crack like ancient porcelain against the rocks of Midway. While Nagumo's fleet sliced through the Pacific darkness, 2,300 miles away in Pearl Harbor, a different kind of battle was reaching its climax. In the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters, Commander Joseph Rochefort hunched over stacks of intercepted Japanese radio transmissions, his eyes red from countless sleepless nights. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as cryptographers worked feverishly to decode the enemy's most secret communications. For months, Rochefort's team had been penetrating the Japanese Navy's primary operational code, designated JN-25 by American intelligence. Through painstaking analysis of intercepted messages, they had discovered references to a major operation targeting a location identified only as AF. The breakthrough came when Rochefort ordered Midway to transmit a false report about water problems, then intercepted a Japanese message stating that AF was short of fresh water. The trap had worked perfectly. Midway was the target. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, studied the intelligence reports with the calm intensity that had made him one of America's most respected naval officers. The Japanese were coming with overwhelming force. 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, numerous cruisers and destroyers, plus invasion transports. Against this armada, Nimitz could muster only 3 carriers, the Enterprise and Hornet under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, and the hastily repaired Yorktown under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, according to a report later published in the U.S. Naval Institute proceedings. The intelligence breakthrough gave the Americans their only chance at victory, advance warning, and the element of surprise. Without Rochefort's codebreakers, the Pacific Fleet would have been caught completely off guard, just as they had been 6 months earlier at Pearl Harbor. The preparation was frantic, but methodical. At Pearl Harbor's dry docks, workers labored, around the clock to repair the Yorktown, which had limped back from the Coral Sea battle with significant damage. Welders worked by torchlight while engineers rerouted damaged systems. What should have taken months was compressed into 72 hours through sheer determination and American industrial ingenuity. The carrier would sail with civilian contractors, still aboard, their repairs continuing even as the ship headed toward battle. On Ford Island, pilots gathered for final briefings in stuffy Quonset huts. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron of Torpedo Squadron 8 stood before his 15 air crews, his weathered face grave as he outlined their mission. The Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers they would fly were obsolete, slow, and vulnerable, but they represented America's best hope of striking the Japanese carriers. Most of the pilots were young ensigns fresh from flight training, their combat experience measured in hours rather than years. The Americans faced daunting odds. Japanese pilots averaged over 800 hours of flight time and years of combat experience from China and the early Pacific campaigns. Their aircraft, the Zero Fighter, Kate torpedo bomber, and Val dive bomber, had proven superior to most American designs. The Mitsubishi Zero, in particular, had dominated every air battle since the war began, its combination of speed, maneuverability, and range making it the world's premier naval fighter. Yet Admiral Nimitz possessed advantages beyond superior intelligence. American damage control techniques, developed through hard experience, far exceeded Japanese capabilities. American pilots, though less experienced, had been trained in aggressive tactics that emphasized teamwork over individual heroics. Most importantly, the battle would be fought near American bases, allowing damaged aircraft to reach friendly airfields rather than ditching in the ocean. As June 4th dawned, the stage was set for the most decisive naval battle since Trafalgar. In the pre-dawn darkness, both fleets prepared for combat, neither fully aware of the other's position or intentions. The Japanese sailed forward with supreme confidence, their naval tradition intact and their victory seemingly assured. The Americans steamed to meet them with grim determination, knowing they faced their last chance to halt Japanese expansion across the Pacific. At exactly 4:30 in the morning, the hangar decks of the Japanese carriers erupted into controlled chaos as flight crews prepared for the opening assault. The rising sun battle flag snapped in the salt breeze as Admiral Nagumo gave the order to launch. 108 aircraft, 36 Nakajima Kate bombers, 36 Aichi Val dive bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi Zero fighters roared from the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu in perfect formation. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the strike force westward through the breaking dawn, his Kate bomber heavily laden with an 1,800-pound bomb intended to crater Midway's airstrip. Behind him, the most experienced naval aviators in the world maintained precise formation, their aircraft engines synchronized like a mechanical symphony. These pilots had perfected their craft over the skies of China and in the early months of the Pacific War, their confidence absolute and their skills unmatched. On Midway Atoll, Marine radar operators detected the incoming formation at 93 miles out. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny island as Colonel Harold Shannon scrambled every available aircraft. 26 Brewster Buffalo fighters, obsolete and outclassed, climbed desperately toward the approaching Japanese formation. Behind them rose a mixed bag of Marine dive bombers and Army flying fortresses, their crews knowing they faced impossible odds, but determined to sell their lives dearly. The aerial combat that followed was a slaughter. The Mitsubishi Zeros, with their superior speed and maneuverability, tore through the American fighters like wolves among sheep. Major Floyd Parks, commanding Marine Fighter Squadron 221, radioed a final message before his Buffalo disintegrated under zero cannon fire. We are going in. This is it. Tell my mother I died fighting. Within minutes, 15 of the 26 Marine fighters had been shot down, their pilots dead or dying in the Pacific waters. Meanwhile, Tomonaga's bombers swept over Midway like an avenging storm. High explosive bombs cratered the runways while incendiaries set fuel dumps ablaze. The powerhouse collapsed in ruins, and the command post took a direct hit. Marine gunners, manning anti-aircraft batteries, fought back desperately, their tracers arcing through the smoke-filled sky. Despite the devastation, they scored hits on several Japanese aircraft, including Tomonaga's bomber, which suffered damage to its fuel tank. But the Americans on Midway had absorbed the Japanese philosophy of Bushido in their own way. Despite the carnage around them, ground crews worked frantically to refuel and rearm any aircraft that could still fly. Marines dragged wounded comrades from burning buildings while continuing to service their guns. The island's defenders had been bloodied but not broken, their fighting spirit intact despite the overwhelming attack. As Tomonaga's strike force began its return flight to the carriers, the lieutenant commander faced a critical decision. His radio crackled with damage reports from his surviving pilots. Midway's installations had been heavily damaged, but the airfield remained operational. American fighters were still taking off from the cratered runway, and anti-aircraft fire remained intense. A second strike would be necessary to completely neutralize the base. At 0700 hours, Tomonaga transmitted his fateful message to Admiral Nagumo. There is need for a second attack wave. This single communication would prove to be one of the most consequential radio transmissions in naval history, setting in motion a chain of events that would shatter Japanese naval supremacy forever. Aboard the Akagi, Nagumo pondered the implications of Tomonaga's report. A second strike meant rearming his reserve aircraft with bombs instead of torpedoes, leaving his fleet vulnerable to surface attack. Intelligence reports suggested no American ships were in the area, but the admiral felt a growing unease. The morning's attack had not gone exactly as planned, and something about the American resistance suggested they had been expecting the assault. Unknown to Nagumo, American search planes were already in the air, their pilots scanning the horizon for signs of the Japanese fleet. The next phase of the battle was about to begin, and with it the first cracks would appear in Japan's seemingly invincible naval tradition. At 0728 hours, Ensign Jack Reed of Patrol Squadron 44 peered through the morning haze from his consolidated Catalina flying boat and spotted the impossible, a vast formation of Japanese warships stretching across the horizon. His radio crackled to life with the message that would change the course of the Pacific War. Enemy carriers bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles. The Japanese fleet had been found. Aboard the flagship Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced the most critical decision of his career. Tomonaga's returning strike force needed immediate recovery, their fuel running dangerously low. Simultaneously, the admiral's staff was frantically rearming the reserve aircraft with bombs for the second attack on Midway. In the hangar decks below, ordnance crews worked desperately to swap torpedoes for land attack bombs, a process that would take precious time to complete. Then came the report that shattered Nagumo's composure like a thunderbolt. At 0745, the cruiser Tone's reconnaissance plane finally transmitted its delayed sighting report. 10 enemy surface ships sighted bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles. The message was incomplete, failing to identify whether aircraft carriers were present, but its implications were terrifying. An American fleet was within striking distance, and Nagumo's carriers were caught in their most vulnerable configuration. The admiral's staff erupted into heated debate. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant air operations officer who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, argued for immediate launch against the American ships. But the aircraft were armed with the wrong ordnance, land attack bombs instead of armor-piercing. Weapons needed to sink warships. Rearming would take at least an hour, possibly 2. Meanwhile, Tomonaga's returning aircraft were running low on fuel and needed to land immediately. According to Samuel Eliot Morrison's authoritative History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, this moment of confusion aboard the Japanese flagship would prove decisive in the battle's outcome. Nagumo's indecision, caught between conflicting tactical requirements, wasted precious time that the Americans would exploit ruthlessly. The first American attack came from Midway itself. Captain Collins led 4 Army flying fortresses in a high-altitude bombing attack against the Japanese carriers, their massive forms clearly visible on the ocean surface. The B-17 bombers dropped their loads from 20,000 feet, but the Japanese ships maneuvered skillfully to avoid the falling bombs. Though unsuccessful, the attack further rattled Nagumo's nerves and confirmed that American forces were coordinating their response. At 08:35, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney launched a second strike from Midway using Marine Scout bombers. The 16 Dauntless dive bombers approached the Japanese fleet at low altitude, their pilots grimly determined to press home their attack despite overwhelming odds. Japanese Zero fighters swarmed to intercept them, their experienced pilots shooting down 8 of the Marines in a matter of minutes. The surviving bombers scored no hits on the carriers, but managed to damage the battleship Haruna with a near miss. Meanwhile, the American carrier forces were closing rapidly. Admiral Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the Enterprise, had received Reed's contact report and immediately ordered his squadrons to launch. The timing was perfect. His aircraft would arrive over the Japanese fleet just as Nagumo's carriers were most vulnerable, their flight decks crowded with returning aircraft and their hangars filled with bombs and fuel. But Spruance's attack was about to face a critical test. His torpedo squadrons, flying the obsolete Devastator bombers, would have to approach the Japanese carriers at low altitude without fighter escort. The Zero fighters waiting above the fleet would slaughter them mercilessly. Yet this sacrifice would serve a crucial purpose, drawing the Japanese fighters down to sea level just as the American dive bombers approached from high altitude. At 09:30 hours, Nagumo finally made his decision. The rearming would continue, but slowly and carefully. Tomonaga's aircraft would land first, refuel, and then the entire strike force would launch against the American fleet. It was a reasonable decision based on the information available, but it would prove catastrophically wrong. The Japanese tradition of methodical planning and perfect execution was about to collide with the chaos of modern naval warfare, and the ancient certainties would crack under the pressure. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron adjusted his goggles and checked his compass one final time as Torpedo Squadron 8 approached the Japanese fleet. Below him, the Pacific stretched endlessly, in all directions, its blue surface broken only by the wakes of enemy warships. His 15 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers flew in perfect formation, their crews knowing they faced almost certain death in the next few minutes. The Devastator was a relic of pre-war aviation, its top speed barely exceeding 100 miles per hour when laden with a torpedo. To successfully attack, Waldron's pilots would have to approach the enemy carriers in a long, straight run at low altitude, making them perfect targets for the superior Japanese fighters. Every man in the squadron understood the odds, yet none wavered in their resolve. At 10:20 hours, the Japanese fleet appeared on the horizon like a vast constellation of steel. 4 aircraft carriers steamed in formation, protected by a screen of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Above them, Mitsubishi Zero fighters circled like hawks, their pilots eager for combat. Commander Shigeru Itaya, leading the carrier air patrol, had already vectored his fighters toward the approaching American formation. Waldron's radio crackled as he gave his final orders. "Attack immediately. We will go straight in. This is our chance. Give them hell." The torpedo bombers dropped to wave-top level, their propellers nearly touching the ocean spray as they began their attack runs. Behind them, the rest of the American strike force was still searching for the Japanese fleet, scattered across hundreds of square miles of empty ocean. The Zero fighters fell on Torpedo Squadron 8 like avenging angels. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya led the first attack, his cannon shells ripping through the lead Devastator's cockpit. Waldron's aircraft burst into flames and cartwheeled into the sea, taking with it one of America's most aggressive squadron. Commanders, the remaining torpedo bombers pressed on, their rear gunners firing desperately at the swarming Japanese fighters. One by one, the Devastators fell from the sky. Ensign George Gay watched his squadron mates die around him as he continued his attack run toward the carrier Kaga. Zero fighters attacked from every angle, their experienced pilots showing no mercy for the slow, vulnerable bombers. Gay zone. Aircraft took multiple hits, its engine smoking and hydraulic fluid streaming from severed lines. But he maintained course toward his target. At 10:30, Gay released his torpedo at point-blank range and pulled up sharply, his damaged Devastator barely clearing the Kaga's flight deck. Seconds later, cannon shells from a pursuing Zero tore through his aircraft's wing, and the bomber plunged into the ocean. Gay managed to escape the wreckage and hide under a floating seat cushion, becoming the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8 and a witness to the carnage that followed. The sacrifice was repeated twice more, as Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown arrived over the Japanese fleet. Commander Eugene Lindsay led VT-6 in a desperate attack against the carriers, but Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire decimated his formation. Only 4 of 14 aircraft survived, and none scored torpedo hits. Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey's VT-3 suffered similar losses, with 10 of 12 aircraft shot down in minutes. Of 41 American torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese fleet that morning, only 6 survived. Not a single torpedo found its target, and the Japanese carriers remained unscathed. The attacks appeared to be complete failures, costly sacrifices that achieved nothing except the deaths of brave air crews. Japanese naval tradition seemed vindicated. Their superior training and equipment had triumphed over American determination. But the torpedo attack served a crucial, unintended purpose. Every Japanese Zero fighter had been drawn down to sea level to massacre the low-flying Devastators. The carrier's combat air patrol was completely out of position when the next wave of American attackers arrived, this time from high altitude, diving out of the sun like birds of prey. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise dive bombers, had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour when he spotted the destroyer Arashi racing northward at high speed. The ship was hurrying to rejoin the main force after depth-charging an American submarine, and McCluskey correctly guessed that following its wake would lead him to the enemy carriers. At 10:24, McCluskey's 37 dauntless dive bombers crested the clouds and found themselves directly above the Japanese fleet. Below them, the carriers were in their most vulnerable state. Flight decks crowded with aircraft, hangars full of bombs and fuel, and their fighter protections scattered at sea level. The moment of Japan's greatest triumph was about to become the beginning of its downfall. Lieutenant Richard Best pushed his Douglas Dauntless into a screaming dive, the carrier Akagi growing larger in his bomb sight with each passing second. At 15,000 feet above the Japanese flagship, he could see the orderly chaos on the flight deck, mechanics servicing aircraft, ordnance crews loading weapons, and sailors preparing for what they believed would be another glorious victory. None of them looked up to see death approaching from the morning sky. The attack came with devastating precision. Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck the Akagi just aft of the midship elevator, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the upper hangar. The blast ignited fuel lines and triggered secondary explosions among the armed aircraft below. Within minutes, Japan's most famous aircraft carrier, veteran of Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the East Indies, was transformed into a floating inferno. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led Yorktown's dive bombers against the carrier Soryu. The attack was perfectly coordinated, with multiple bombs striking the ship within seconds of each other. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto, who had reviewed his battle plan so confidently just hours earlier, found his ship erupting in flames around him. The Soryu's aviation fuel and ordnance created an uncontrollable blaze that would doom the carrier within hours. The third victim was the Kaga, Pearl Harbor veteran and pride of the Japanese carrier fleet. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, personally, led the attack against this massive ship, his bomb striking near the bridge and setting off a chain reaction of explosions. The carrier's wooden flight deck, soaked with aviation gasoline from recent refueling operations, became a sea of fire that spread throughout the ship. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Admiral Nagumo's 4 aircraft carriers had been transformed, from proud symbols of Japanese naval supremacy into burning wrecks. The carefully orchestrated ballet of carrier operations, the precise timing, methodical procedures, and disciplined execution that had made the Japanese Navy invincible, collapsed into chaos and confusion. Centuries of naval tradition cracked, like thin ice under the weight of American bombs. Admiral Nagumo stood on the Akagi's bridge, his face ashen as he watched his flagship die around him. Smoke poured from the elevator shafts while explosions deep in the ship shook the entire vessel. The admiral who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, who had never known defeat, was forced to transfer his flag to a cruiser as his proud carrier settled by the stern. The symbol of Japanese naval aviation was burning and would soon rest on the Pacific floor. The surviving carrier Hiryu, under Captain Tomeo Kaku's command, launched immediate counterstrikes against the American fleet. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 dive bombers through heavy fighter opposition to attack the Yorktown, scoring 3 bomb hits that severely damaged the American carrier. A second strike by torpedo bombers added 2 more hits, leaving the Yorktown dead in the water and listing heavily to port. But the Hiryu's victories came at terrible cost. Most of her experienced pilots were shot down during the attacks, and by afternoon she faced the same fate as her sister ships. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, flying a borrowed aircraft after his own was damaged, led a final American strike against the last Japanese carrier. Multiple bomb hits turned the Hiryu into another blazing wreck, completing the destruction of Nagumo's carrier force. As the sun set on June 4, 1942, the wreckage of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers littered the Pacific. With them died over 3,000 sailors and airmen, including many of Japan's most experienced naval aviators. The pilots who had perfected their skills over China and in the early months of the Pacific War were gone forever, their expertise impossible to replace in wartime. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship hundreds of miles away, received the reports in stunned silence. The combined fleet, which had seemed invincible just that morning, had suffered its first major defeat. The careful balance of power in the Pacific had shifted in a single day, and Japan's offensive capability was permanently crippled. The Battle of Midway marked more than a tactical victory for the United States. It represented the moment when Japanese naval tradition, built over centuries of careful cultivation, finally cracked under the pressures of modern warfare. The samurai spirit, technological superiority, and tactical excellence that had carried the rising sun to triumph after triumph proved insufficient against American industrial capacity, cryptographic intelligence, and the desperate courage of pilots like John Waldron and his squadron. In the aftermath, as rescue ships searched for survivors among the floating debris, both sides understood that the Pacific War had reached its turning point. Japan would never again possess the strength to mount major offensive operations, while America began the long advance that would eventually lead to Tokyo Bay. The tradition of Japanese naval supremacy, unbroken since the days of Admiral Togo, had finally met its match in the waters around a tiny atoll called Midway.